Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 58th Annual Ann Arbor Film Fest tour, but this is the virtual edition. My name is Sarah Naraki, and I am the Director of Wealthy Theater, and I am joined here today with Andrew Coulon, who is the librarian over at Grand Rapids Public Library. How you doing, Andrew?
Good.
Awesome. So this is actually the fourth year in a row that Wealthy Theater has teamed up with the Grand Rapids Public Library to bring this touring experimental film festival to our community. Normally this would be hosted either at Wealthy Theater, or last year we actually did it at the library, where not only we're screening the films, but we have various film crafts and activities. But you know, we've got to do things a little bit differently this year. But don't worry, because even though we can't gather together in person for this event, we are still going to provide you with free access to all of the activities from the comfort of your very own home. So thanks to the Grand Rapids Public Library Foundation and the Grand Rapids Community Media Center, we are able to bring you an exclusive screening of the awards-won program from the 2020 Ann Arbor Film Festival. Along with that, we have a panel discussion for you tonight featuring a couple of local film scholars. And then we even have a take-home kit so you can do your own DIY experimental filmmaking from home. How cool is that? So Andrew, why don't we start with, tell us a little bit about the foundation. There might be some folks watching tonight who are unfamiliar with your foundation.
Yeah, so the Grand Rapids Public Library Foundation exists to support the library and support the mission of the library. So they offer funding for a lot of the programs that go on throughout the year. They accept donations and have other fundraising activities that they do, but a lot of their funds go right into the programs that we do. So in the summer we do GR Reads, summer reading program, Taste of Soul in February. Throughout the year, all those programs are supported by the foundation. The Ann Arbor Film Festival is, for the last 2 years, has been one of those programs that they support.
That's fantastic.
So, absolutely, big, huge thanks to them for their work to help support the mission and bring these types of events to the community.
We are absolutely thankful for that too. And not only this program, but just Grand Rapids Public Library has a plethora of resources. So if we're specifically talking about film, what other great resources are there for library card holders?
Well, so as you probably expect, we have a very solid DVD collection, which is still available. So if you have your library card, you can come in, you can call us, place DVDs on hold. We can have those sent around. We've got a very nice collection that way. But some people don't realize we've also got some digital streaming options. One of them is Canopy. It's a very, very high quality service. It's free to use with your library card. So once you get your library card, you can log into the Canopy website and you can stream documentaries, all kinds of stuff, experimental film, Criterion Collection.
Yeah. Even award winners on there. I know we've talked about like the A24 films and other Oscar-nominated films. I couldn't even believe what was on Canopy.
Yeah, it's a really, really awesome collection. We also have another service called Hoopla, which has quite a good collection of stuff. That one is also free with your library card. So there's two. You can stream those on a computer, your smartphone, but a lot of the smart TV, Roku, Apple TV, Chromecast, a lot of those things also have apps. So you can stream it on your television as well. If once you go through the setup process, it takes a little bit. But,
so now, what if somebody listening here wants to check out these services but hasn't yet registered for a library card? I know it might be a little tricky with the library not being open as regular hours, so how could they go about taking care of that?
Yep. So most of our branches, as of right now today, we are open to the public, and you can stop in and you can sign up for a library card at the circulation desk. We do have some reduced services right now because of COVID and some other things. You can also go to the Grand Rapids Public Library website, and there is a form you can fill out to sign up for a card online. And there's a few things that they'll ask to verify your address and your identity. But once you do that, once you go through fill out the form and go through the process, they will send you a card in the mail, and you can start downloading and streaming ebooks, movies, everything right away.
awesome. It's
Fine free. So
that's
if
amazing.
yeah, so if your card was blocked, come back and contact us. There's a very good chance some of those fines have already been forgiven. Um, yeah, so we just want to get people access as easily as possible, especially right now in this with everything that's gone on this last year.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and one thing that I'll just shamelessly pitch as a service that the library has access to, if you are feeling inspired by the films that you see today or the discussions that we have and you want to dive deeper into filmmaking, lynda.com is another resource, which is, tutorial videos on learning different software and things like that. And I've used it for the Adobe Creative Suite because Premiere Pro is a really great video editing program. Final Cut is on there. I'm sure there's even some other free programs that, whether it's for Mac or PC, you could check out
Mhm.
and learn the 101s and start making movies of your own. And then hopefully we'll see you here in the Ann Arbor Film Fest lineup. So definitely a good idea to get your card renewed or get a new one going and get into these free programs. So that's
Yep.
fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
Yep.
Now, as we mentioned, normally when we do this in person, we have some hands-on crafts that you can do and learn about stop motion animation and painting on film and doing hand processing. So, Andrew, do we have anything like that for our viewers this year?
We do. We're lucky to have. We're going to be doing some hand processing crafts with a film strip, and you can, if you stop by the library, you can pick up a film festival kit. And in the kit, we've got some supplies, and you can go ahead and make a film strip, and then you'll pack it up, pack it back in the envelope, and bring it back to the library. And with the help of Sarah and her team, we're going to compile those into a long community made experimental film. So supplies are going to be a little bit limited for this project. So you want to stop by. We're going to be distributing those through the main library. And yeah, the deadline is going to be March 1st for returning the film strips. So
I can't wait to see all these
yeah,
films come together. I think
yeah,
it's going to be really neat. I believe there's a term for it called Anajam, where you put a bunch of different animations together and see how it kind of unfolds. So it'll be
yeah,
great. And we're kicking around ideas of
yeah,
involving music with it too.
yep,
So definitely
yep.
stay
So
tuned and we'll give some updates on that.
yeah, yeah, this is going to be definitely a growing community art project over the next month. So um, if you're interested, give us a call. Call the library, or the pickup for the kits is going to be at the main library in downtown.
Excellent. That's great. So, just a reminder to everybody who wants to participate in that, be sure to return those film strips, though, so that we can compile that community reel. We'll be splicing them all together and then showcasing that reel. In addition to that, not only do we have a tutorial video and some printed instructions for how to do the
Yep.
hand processing, but we've also made a tutorial for creating stop motion animation. And there's one film in this lineup called Candy Shop, which is a great example of stop motion animation. So if you want to try that out and make your own film, we have that tutorial video available online. If you go to grpl.org, we will have it listed there, and as well as through Wealthy Theater, we'll be posting it there too. So if this whole program inspires you not only to make a hand processed film or stop motion or just grab a camera and go film something of your own, we are also providing a Dropbox link available through both of our websites where you can upload your project. So hopefully we'll have a really big showcase this spring, not only of the 16 millimeter film, but other creative projects too. So we're really looking forward to your submissions. So be sure to check out the websites and learn more about how you can do that. Our hope is to be able to not only showcase the films, but rebroadcast them on our local public access station, GRTV. And on GRTV, we're also going to be re-airing today's panel discussion, which is at the end of this event. So in case you watch the films but have to jump out early, don't worry. You'll want to be able to check out that panel discussion, and we'll have it available for you at a later time. All right, Andrew, you ready for this film fest?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you guys all for tuning in. We are going to shift it over to the actual film fest, and then be sure to stay tuned for the panel discussion afterwards. We'll see you back here in just a minute.
¿Quién es?
No sé, pues está ahora de camarero. Resulta que decía que tal día se acababa el mundo. ¿Cómo que tal día se acaba el mundo? Sí, se va a acabar el mundo tal día. Resulta que él le iba diciendo a toda la gente, oye, cerrar los negocios, dejar del trabajo, dejar las cosas, gastaros todo el dinero, que se va a acabar el mundo. Entonces resulta que ha llegado el día y no se acaba el mundo. Y ahora resulta que el que se ha quedado sin nada y que tiene que estar trabajando para poder comer y pagar el alquiler es él. Está el gilipollas, llamaba a toda la gente y ahora es él el gilipollas.
Pues sí, desde luego. Bueno, ¿y tú qué has hecho? ¿Qué te has quedado súper bien?
Pues he hecho dieta a base de verdura, a base de todo a la plancha, a cuidarme un poquito porque ya me estaba pasando y todo a base de mucha frutita, mucha verdura.
En tickets y la de grupo recibirá un total de 30 euros en tickets de consumición. Se consumirán mitad y mitad en la barra del campo de fútbol y en Café Bar Aurelio. Participa en el concurso del verano.
Sí, porque aquí pasa una historia que hace unos años un pastor por el monte estaba durmiendo debajo de una encina y vino la oveja y la oveja aquí tienen, la saliva que tienen efecto narcótico y pues se quedó dormido y le comió la cara y desde entonces pues la gente por el miedo que tienen hacia las ovejas pues van con la máscara puesta cuando duermen la siesta.
Ah, qué curioso.
Sí, para que veas.
Sí.
Top 50, solo los números 1.
Ahora puedes adquirir tus gafas de sol más innovadoras a un precio inmejorable en Perfect Vision. Las gafas de sol Running Innovation están hechas para que puedas grabar, escuchar música y hablar por teléfono gracias a la conexión Bluetooth y a los dos micrófonos laterales. Solo en Perfect Vision. Números libres para llamadas telefónicas, indicaciones GPS, envíos de SMS, WhatsApp, rutas programadas, información sobre el tiempo y vídeo Full HD. Ven a conocerlas a Perfect Vision y también por casos de innovación para el deporte. Perfect Vision, innovamos pensando en ti.
ajena. Y Dios le dio una hija que era muy buena, cristiana, que todas las mañanas oía misa con alegría de modo. Creía en la Virgen María y en San Antonio. Sus padres eran muy malos, la castigaban y a su inocente hija la maltrataban diciendo: mira cómo me han puesto pelada, de golpes maltratada la cara, toda llena de heridas y ensangrentada. Alcanzó San Antonio desde el Supremo de darle a su devota su hermoso pelo, blancura, doblada su hermosura y tan bella, que pensaban sus padres que no era ella. Padrecitos del alma, si usted me extraña, miren que soy la hija de sus entrañas, nacida por San Antonio, protegida, milagro, que San Antonio ha obrado amoroso, volviéndome este pelo santo y glorioso. Desde entonces sus padres cristianos fueron, la ley de Jesucristo siempre siguieron. ¿Os ha gustado? Muy bien.
¿Tú qué es? ¿Tú qué es?
Jorge, tú has ganado Cirilo, hecha.
Sí, sí.
Vosotros bastos. Yo no tengo.
Que no se
Ya
la
lo sé
botan
yo que
los
no hay.
bastos,
Pues espadas son trunfos.
Oye, ¿dónde estarán las espadas?
Ya no hay.
Toma, Cirilo, para ti.
No, para Cirilo que ha echado bastos.
Venga, dale.
Y otro que tienes mío.
Ahí va, bueno.
¡Hala! Otro para
Oye,
Cirilo.
Antonio, vaya paliza.
Vaya tela marinera. Ahora doy yo.
A ver,
¡Hala!
tres.
Que no cuente, hombre, no cuente, que llevan muy poca.
Eficacia en el servicio, solvencia capaz de 20 años de experiencia, categorías y prestigio, reformas y acondicionamiento de todo tipo de instalaciones. Tome nota, 927-21.
Comenzás a contar.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Con este agua, llevar cuidado. Lo mejor sería tirarla por el váter.
Tratamiento del agua, iluminación LED.
Poliéster luz fina, en el polígono industrial primario de Manzanillo.
7101, viajada.
Disfruta de tu destino.
Vamos. Pau, vamos.
¿Qué pasa? ¿Cuántas tierras harían para que yo sacara? ¡Ey! Venga, pobrecillo. ¡Qué tonto soy! Esta lucha no funciona.
Now, I've got a clean copy of it now, and I warn you, this could scare you. Here's the email. Dear Art Bell, I just recently began listening to your radio show and could not believe it when you talked about the sounds from hell tonight. The story about the digging of the hole and the hearing of the sounds from hell is very real. It did occur in Siberia. My uncle collected videos and audio tapes on the paranormal, supernatural. He let me listen to one of the audio tapes that he had on the sounds from hell in Siberia, and I copied it. He received his copy from a friend who worked at the BBC. Attached is that sound from my uncle's tapes. I was very hesitant to send you this, as the sound bothers me to listen to. I'd suggest that if you do play it on the program, warn listeners in advance so they may have the option of turning the radio off for 30 seconds while it plays. To those who discounted the Siberia sounds from Hell story, it is true, and I, for one, wish it wasn't. Rick, listening from Chicago. I warn you, what you're about to hear is very disturbing indeed.
As they vied for world supremacy throughout the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union engaged in a bitter competition of ideological one-upmanship. First into space, first to the moon, who had the biggest bombs, the fastest planes, the best basketball team. But a lesser known and perhaps more peculiar contest between the two superpowers was to see which country could dig the deepest hole.
Man's knowledge of the earth is a little like an ant on the surface of an apple who wants to understand the apple but cannot penetrate its skin. The skin of an apple, proportionately, is about as thick as the crust of the earth. A scientific project is underway, a project called Project Mohol, which hopes one day to drill a hole through the crust of the earth and to find out what's down there.
Project Mohol was a US effort to penetrate the Earth's crust and reach the Mohorific discontinuity, a magma-filled layer 10 miles below the surface. A joint project of the American Miscellaneous Society and the National Science Foundation, Project Mohol began in 1961 on a drilling platform off the coast of Southern California. Coincidentally, just 2 months later, the Soviets formed the Interdepartmental Scientific Council for the Study of the Earth's Interior and Super-Deep Drilling, and began digging a hole of their own on the remote tip of the Kola Peninsula. The Earth Sciences race had officially begun.
Our knowledge of the structure of planet Earth is growing from year to year. We know that it consists of a core, a mantle, and a crust. But many fundamental questions remain unanswered.
In 1966, Project Mohol had reached a depth of only 601 feet before technical issues put it on an indefinite hiatus. But its Soviet counterpart, the Kola Super-Deep Borehole, was just getting started and would soon be reaching depths previously untouched by humankind. By all counts, the Soviets were winning the Earth Sciences race.
Let me read to you this account. Dr. Victor Azakov.
Dr. Azakov.
Dr. Azakov was on a mission with other scientists to drill a 9-mile deep hole in remote Siberia,
where scientists, Russian scientists, were drilling into the core of the Earth down some 14 kilometers.
After drilling several miles into the bedrock, something strange began to happen.
They were drilling and they came to a point where the drill shaft began to spin very rapid and violently.
Dr. Azakov states, at about 2,000 feet down, a cavern had been reached.
They hit some kind of cavern or pocket.
Temperature sensors showed a dramatic increase in heat to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
Was some 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
To 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
It is almost as if there was a fiery inferno raging into the Earth's core.
Very hot.
Ang ginawa po nila, nagbaba po sila ng microphone.
So they took a microphone designed to listen to the tectonic plates shifting and moving, and they dropped that microphone down some 14 kilometers into this cavern.
But instead of the plate movement, we heard a human voice screaming in pain.
A human voice screaming in pain.
We could also make out, as if in the background, the screams of thousands, perhaps millions of tormented souls.
Ng actual sounds of hell.
This is what they heard. Play it.
From coast to coast, live via satellite, it's time to praise the Lord.
News from the Kola Super-Deep Borehole took a curious turn in the early 1990s. The Trinity Broadcast Network, the world's largest Christian broadcaster, reported a troubling story involving a scientific drilling project. Russian scientists had reportedly discovered a deep, unexpected cavity that was a scorching 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit and emitting a strange sound. The perplexed researchers lowered heat-resistant microphones into the hole, and to their astonishment heard what sounded like thousands, if not millions, of people screaming in agony. Concerned how this discovery would tarnish the communist doctrine of state-mandated atheism, Soviet officials hypnotized and erased the memories of the witnesses in an effort to cover up the incident. But not before Dr. Dmitry Azikov, the project's lead scientist, was able to escape and defect to Norway. Now living in exile, Dr. Azikov had a tape recording of the sound and was eager to share it with the world. The Russians had inadvertently drilled to hell. And this discovery, the Trinity Broadcast Network suggested, was scientific proof that hell was in fact real.
Okay, first of all, where is hell located?
In the middle of the earth, and it's in the shape of a human body, and it's on its back. And there's different levels, different degrees, different fires of torment.
How does someone enter hell?
Through a gateway.
Well,
There's
tell me what
gateways
it
called
looks like.
tunnels. They're kind of like tunnels or tornadoes, and they spin around and back again in the atmosphere. And they're hooked to the earth. And they call them tunnels, but Jesus calls them gateways to hell.
The story of Dr. Azikov spread rampantly, and copies of the recorded Sounds of Hell were played and distributed in churches around the world. The story also found fertile soil on the then burgeoning internet. It became legendary in early chat rooms and email chain letters, and to this day still garners considerable online attention. But as the story rose in prominence, it became evident that TBN's reporting was less than reliable. Skeptical fact-checkers found that Dr. Azikov did not seem to exist, and inquisitive cinephiles concluded that the Sounds of Hell audio recording was in fact a sound effect taken from the 1972 Italian horror film Baron Blood. As it became clear their story was entirely fabricated, TBN neither retracted nor corrected their reporting. They simply stopped mentioning it and pretended the whole thing never happened.
Baron Blood.
By 1994, the Kola Super Deep borehole was nearly 8 miles deep, making it by far the deepest hole ever drilled by humankind. Cores pulled from the borehole were dated to be 2.7 billion years old, and the project provided invaluable scientific information regarding the Earth's age and internal processes. But the collapse of the Soviet Union brought the project to an end, and today the Kola Super Deep borehole is a ruin, abandoned and rusting away in the vast Arctic tundra. A bolted metal cap is all that separates the surface from the deepest hole on Earth.
In the dream, I was in a room with a figure. He was tall and covered in white. The dream and everything it implied remained unspoken as I grew into adolescence. He would never feel that it really existed, but only that it felt so. As long as one could use the world to see the future, then at the same time there would never be any regret. So we didn't feel sad about the present or the past. How could there be regret when he had lived as a god? Was it possible to live with these kinds of expectations? He stopped talking and looked around. His eyes were filled with uncertainty. He wasn't sure what to do next. All they need now is the courage to cross the river and make their way to the other side, to the one who will take them from here into the land of the living, into the other world in its fullness. One begins with a wish to reach the other side of some impenetrable barrier. In other words, to cross the river, to reach the other side. But what is there, after all, to be gained by doing so? And what is there to be gained from looking out upon the world from the other side? When one is traveling to the other side, life must be taken apart and returned into its original place. I don't think that I could survive this. I don't think it would be possible, but I have to. I thought I would love you for your own sake, but you never talked to me or asked any questions. For more than a month, your silence made me hate you. She was kind to me. She took my hand and led me into the house. Come along with me. Don't worry. I could hear her laugh. When we were alone, she was warm. As the summer heat rose, the sky grew darker. As the night fell, I sat in the shadow of the tree, wishing for the stars to rise in the night. But the stars stayed still. I knew nothing. I was so confused. It was so hard to answer, but I just kept saying I didn't have a choice. When she got upset, I just pretended she didn't. We laughed, and I felt better for a little while. It was then that she told me that she had already sent me the money because I said I was leaving. I knew it was wrong. It made me realize how hard it is for me to be happy. But it is the hardest life choice I have ever had to make. But I made it. I didn't make those choices for the right reasons, but I could not make the choices my family demanded. You have your own little home on the water, and it's a quiet place where only you can hear. No one can really hear you, so there is no one that must know your thoughts. There is no one who can see your face, so there must be no one here who can see that smile. Nothing in this world can touch your happiness, but it will come when you are happy. You have to have the courage to be yourself, and you are brave. Nothing in this world can tear you down. No matter what happens, you will not be broken. No matter what you did, you will become a better person for the experience. You have been through the most difficult thing in the world. Nothing in this world will ever break you.
40ට 4 කියන ප්‍රකාශනය 40න් ගුණ කරලා තියෙනවා. දැන් අපි තෝරාගත්තේ 40 මේ
I don't know how I can describe how I feel. In the morning, I don't think that I got to dream my head. Sometimes I think, that's what happened. I don't know how dreams could be so vivid. You see, as you grow older, you forget most of the details of your early years. But the memory of the past is much stronger and more in your brain than the memory of what you had for lunch yesterday. Baby years, small child, schoolboy, university student, and then if you get married, your first years of marriage, becoming a parent. Every stage of your life directs your thoughts and daily preoccupations to another sphere, to another direction. A lot of things happened during my lifetime. A lot of things have happened. What I think of the world, I cannot answer this question. I never had the urge of seeing it all, visiting it all. I started working when I was 21, I think. My experiences were between 1950 and 60. I don't remember which was the first time, but I was not a very good sailor. I was enjoying it when the sea was smooth. When it was not, I was not so happy. After 1960, I was behind the office. I thought that was my duty and my work, my contribution to the family business. "95% of the time I was in the office. I was not ambitious enough to travel more on my own to find out what this country was like and what were the differences in people living in certain parts of the globe, different parts of the globe. My activities is to tidy things around the house, sit in my desk, write notes, and I do go for a walk almost every day. I know I had a camera which I had bought in New York in the late 50s, I suppose. Or perhaps I got it wrong. It was an American camera that I bought in London in the early 60s. I'm not absolutely sure. Mostly I filmed people. But also all I captured quite a few occasions, like christenings, like weddings, travel. Things like monuments. The Acropolis would have been one subject I would want to film. Yeah. It was full of color, but no, it's you can say it's a shadow, but what remains there is original. Old age doesn't make you more beautiful or more wise. Your muscles deteriorate, and my memory is not as quick as it was before. But you can relive an experience in your sleep. Some dreams lately are exceedingly vivid, precise, detailed people, friends, acquaintances, and only past association and experiences you had with them for fun or for business or for travel, and it is sad. And when you see somebody go, it is quite difficult to swallow and to understand and to accept. And it's also a reminder that your time cannot be very far away. But sometimes I see some dreams that are so vivid that I feel certain that it was reality. And these dreams did not, that's even more disturbing, happen at night. And these things I must have dreamt during times when I was sure I was awake.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this virtual event. My name is Sarah Naraki, and I'm the director of Wealthy Theater. I will be moderating tonight's panel, which is a follow-up to the 58th Annual Ann Arbor Film Festival Tour. Community Media Center's Wealthy Theater teamed up with the Grand Rapids Public Library and the Grand Rapids Public Library Foundation to make this touring film festival accessible for our community for the third year in a row. If you are just tuning into this panel, please note that we are discussing the Awards Won program from the 58th Ann Arbor Film Festival. These include some of the award-winning films from the 2020 program. If you've not yet watched this block of films, head over to aafilmfest.org to find out how you can access the movies. This discussion will also be available as a podcast through Wealthy Theater and will be re-aired on GRTV. Now, just a side note, we do not represent Ann Arbor Film Festival. We are just local film enthusiasts and scholars who've come together to analyze some films. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our wonderful panelists. Anal and Spencer, thank you guys so much for joining me tonight. How's it going?
Real good. Thanks for having me.
Good, good. Well, why don't you guys go ahead and introduce yourselves? Anal, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah, for inviting us. My name's Anal Shah. I teach at Grand Valley State University. I teach film production primarily, and within that, I teach a course in film and video art, sometimes experimental cinema as well. So my background really is in photography, and I came into experimental cinema as a grad student many years ago, and it really sort of expanded and opened up the possibilities for me as a filmmaker. So it's primarily a documentary filmmaker that works out of India. I tend to sort of make documentaries in a slightly experimental mode.
Great, that's fantastic. So happy to have you on this panel. And Spencer, how about you? Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, my name is Spencer Arbor, and I'm actually a colleague of Anal. I also teach in the film and video department at Grand Valley. And my own interest in experimental film also, I would say, probably came out when I was in graduate school. But it really took off because of the Ann Arbor Film Festival, actually. I started attending the fest probably back in like 2012, around there, and I've attended it almost every year since then, including last year when it was online and digital because of the pandemic. And so, yeah, going every year, seeing those films as they were sort of premiering, attending Q&As, talking to filmmakers only kind of like enhanced it. And then I've also had the opportunity to include some of that kind of stuff in my own classes and teaching, which is also exciting because it usually kind of comes at students in a way that they're not expecting, which is always pretty exciting for discussion.
Definitely. Yeah, I know it's kind of a hard genre to get into, but I think it's a really good one to talk about because it really gets to kind of the fundamentals of filmmaking and questions the process of filmmaking too. So that's why this panel tonight, I'm hoping we can really dive into some of the films from this program and analyze them, compare them, whether to, the standard of Hollywood films that we're used to or even other mediums. Experimental art is not limited to filmmaking. We see it in music and 2D, like painting, drawing. It's all over the place. So, but tonight we're talking about film. So, Spencer, I'm going to throw a question back to you. Can you kind of explain to us what experimental filmmaking is?
I can try. Well, I would say one of the first things about it that trying to pin it down and give a concise or like a summary of what it is difficult because of the nature of it being so diverse and having such a long history and having so many different sort of filmmakers and movements involved within it. But I usually try to situate it within the idea that most experimental filmmaking exists outside of the mainstream commercial context of a cinema production, and which is to say, like most movies that people watch, which are feature-length, narrative films that are made by either the mainstream industry or by independent companies. These films are usually made by artists, usually working alone or with smaller kind of crews, and are not functioning within the commercial sphere. They're usually not trying to get these films, distributed tons of theaters. They're usually not in it for the profit motive. And there's a little bit more of an incentive to make these films purely for the sake of either artistic expression or exploring the formal possibilities of filmmaking, or maybe trying to express, ideas and experiences that don't lend themselves to the typical ways that movies, tell stories. Oftentimes, experimental films don't even have stories, which is one of the things that makes them, difficult or maybe unusual for folks, is because they don't have the usual structure of a narrative to kind of guide them through it. And that can be frustrating sometimes, but if you kind of go with it and give yourself over to it, it can be really exciting too, I think, at least.
Yeah, definitely. Even though you say it doesn't, an experimental film doesn't necessarily have a story to it. I remember, was it the 57th Ann Arbor Film Fest, I think, maybe 56. One of the programs that we had at the theater, there was an animation that was really abstract. You don't have a protagonist, antagonist, anything like that. But when we were breaking it down, it did still have kind of 3 acts, which is traditional for, again, a Hollywood-style movie. And I felt like it was more in the music as well as the tones, the colors and things like that. You could see an emotional shift through it. So it's really fascinating to see how we can adapt the formal style of filmmaking and storytelling that we know and put it into an abstract form like this. Now, you're a filmmaker. What's your experience with experimental filmmaking?
I think it allows me to get, at the most sort of literal level, experiment with the medium itself, experiment with the surface sort of quality of the medium, whether it's video or celluloid film. And then, you were talking about the narrative structure and how sort of experimental films, go outside of that structure. Similarly, in my own practice, it allows me to kind of bend conventions in documentary filmmaking.
That's great. And Spencer, how about you? What kind of experimental filmmaking experience do you have?
I don't have a ton. Most of what I've messed around with was when I was in grad school. But because I went to grad school for cinema studies and not necessarily film production, I didn't have a ton of opportunities to do it. But I did take one course because I was like, while I'm here, I want to try. I want to get my hands on some film, especially shoot some film. And so I was involved in this workshop course where we went on this retreat for a weekend and shot 60 millimeter film, and everything that we shot there was then taken back, and we made a number of projects out of it. So most of what I've made kind of was born out of that one weekend of footage that I shot. But there's been a couple projects here and there that I've made from it. And again, it was purely stuff made out of just the spirit of like experimentation, which I think is another part of like, it's obvious because it's in the name in terms of what we're talking about. But one of the things that I find interesting and thrilling about it on both sides, maybe creating it and watching it, is that like a true experiment, to be an experiment, like risks failure, right? And so the kind of risk that you take to try and make something, to create something, to try something out, the risk is always there of failing, and that sort of, it gives it a little extra something, like a little extra edge, I guess you could say, that I find really interesting for a lot of these types of artist-driven works.
That's a really good point about taking the risks, and it's the nature of experimenting. The professor that I had for my experimental film class is actually at Grand Valley, Ann Haydock. I'm not sure if you guys know her, but she's wonderful. I love her so much. And she, in all of our assignments, she always said, you got to write down what the happy accidents were and try to teach us, don't look at it as a mistake, but happy accidents that turn into something really cool. And to that note, one of the activities that we're doing as part of this year's virtual film tour through the library is providing hand processing film kits for people to pick up. And if you go to grpl.org, You can learn more about how you can register to get your own film kit. And what you do with that, you'll have 16 millimeter clear leader. So it's this film that we're talking about. And you could take ink or markers or paint or whatever and put it on the film. And then when you run it through the projector, it kind of looks like, a kaleidoscope or sort of a stained glass kind of image. And it's all about taking risks and the happy accidents and just let's see what happens. So that's just one of the techniques of experimental filmmaking. But why don't we dive into the movies from Program 1 and we can kind of see how all of these are different or see what they have in common too. So let's see, how about Anal, do you want to tell us maybe a couple of the favorite films or movies that stood out to you in the Awards 1 program?
Sure. I sort of want to, if I may, just add to the conversation that we were having about, what experimental cinema is, and then sort of like, I think there are as many definitions of experimental cinema as there are experimental films. I think if a film sort of adheres, if it falls within the conventions of an experimental film, then it's not really an experimental film, because by the definition of the term, the film has to experiment to become an experimental film. So my favorite film from the program definitely was the film from Sri Lanka, Raji's film, The Eyes of Summer. I think it's multiple reasons. I mean, one of them being the fact that it's a South Asian film. So obviously I respond to it culturally in ways that I may not, respond to some of the other films. But more than that, I think that there are things within the film that resist creating meaning. That we, it has a very conventional film language. Grammatically speaking, it's more of a classical kind of narrative style. Yet it resists creating meaning, and it sort of, by doing that, it doesn't exactly deprive us as the viewer to infer meaning, but instead it kind of forces us to create our own meaning. And I think that's one of the greatest things that the film language can achieve, whether it's experimental or not, where it respects the audience enough to create their own meaning, where it provokes thought. And I think that the earliest experimentalists, arguably were Russians and the European avant-garde, like the Surrealists. And I think that's what they did. So I think it really kind of stays within that essence of what an experimental film is about. And it also reminds me of the great Thai filmmaker, Vichapong Virasasakul, also known as Joe in the Western world. His cinema. Spencer, you might remember the name, A Mysterious Object at Noon.
Oh, yeah.
Also black and white, a different kind of idea there. But so that was definitely my favorite if I were to pick one. But I liked all of the films for various other things.
I thought The Eyes of Summer, one of the things that really drew me to it was some of the techniques. And it certainly had a lot of, I don't know if I want to say an homage or inspiration from other experimental filmmakers. I mean, literally, we have a moment that feels like Stan Brackage's Mothlight, because you have the moth that's kind of trapped up against, it looks like a screen. And it's great because it just flutters by very quickly, and your ears are kind of assaulted with the soundscape from it too. So it's very jarring, like Stan Brakhage. But then you get back into these more kind of atmospheric and meditative shots. But yeah, it's all over the place and very beautiful. Spencer, what did you think about this one?
Yeah, I responded to it mainly on the level of kind of along with what Anal was talking about, how it has like its structure or the construction of it on a shot-to-shot basis. You can follow fairly easily because, like Anal was saying, like the language of it is not so unfamiliar. but what the shots actually are, or what the film is kind of doing, is much more mysterious, or it's much more abstract. And I think this film and a couple of the other films actually in the program kind of experiment with narrative in this way, you could say, you know. Sometimes I feel like there's an impulse to try and like force a narrative onto an experimental film because you want to make sense of it in that way. And sometimes that can be useful and productive, but also sometimes you're kind of forcing the film to be something it's not. But with this one, yeah, I was just struck by how kind of what Anil said, how open it felt. You know, despite the fact that there is a specificity to the setting and the events that maybe we're seeing unfold, the filmmaker really has shaped the film in a way which is sort of generous in a sense for us as the viewers. You know, it's sort of given over to us in a sense that we can kind of take with it and do what we will. And that's not to say that there isn't like an artistic hand guiding it, of course, like it's edited and it's shot to the whims of the filmmaker. Although I'm pretty sure that I think the structure was improvised to a certain extent. I feel like I remember reading that in the program notes, which is also another interesting element of it. But I was struck by just the way that a narrative or a semi-narrative structure can be conveyed in this format that allows for you to kind of come into it or even leave out of it in certain ways. And like I said, there's a couple other films in the program that do that too, that I was really struck by as well.
The note that you said just a minute ago of how sometimes with experimental films, they don't have a narrative, but you try to force one on it or try to find a story in it. No doubt there's an experimental film out there that plays with that technique of trying to get the audience to, you know, guess like what the story is and make it feel like there's a story, but there's not. And that could be the point of the film too. I feel like I usually get caught up more in the technicalities and sort of the aesthetics or the atmosphere of the film. And with this one, I'm going to bring this shot back up here. I wish I had like a GIF of it or a clip that I could play. And I know it's kind of hard to see here, but in this particular shot, you have lines and motion going in different directions, which was pretty frequently repeated a theme throughout. And in this shot, you have the ants going up the tree, but then you've got, and I'm doing this backwards, the diagonals going across. In previous shots, it might have been, you know, looking at a road, so you've got the you know, perspective, the line there that's forcing your eye down the middle. Mm-hmm. But then you have somebody who's crossing, you know, left and right, and so all this kind of direction. So in the same way that you're trying to make a narrative and trying to find like a linear story through the whole film and it's not there, I feel like that's also visually represented with the crossing lines within the scene, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I want to sort of argue, I mean, I kind of almost want to use this opportunity to break, you know, to really comment on the tyranny of the story that has sort of really clouded a majority of our expectations in cinema. I mean, our experience of life is not in stories. It's in events, feelings, images, emotions, and we sort of artificially create, you know, make stories out of them in our sort of memory or when we recount our experiences. And I think that's where this film is recounting of, you know, the filmmaker's mother's experiences. Chances are that, you know, they were like, the filmmaker was told these stories through a tradition of oral storytelling, and then it's a sort of creation of that. But precisely the fact that it does not, you know, cater to that expectation of the story in the viewer, that we are all sort of guilty of. You know, we that's what we expect when we see a film. We want a story, and that's because the industry has kind of, you know, cashed out on that desire, or maybe has artificially created that desire in us. So now when we see a film, we expect a story. But I also want to like talk about how the film has a dialogue, and I want to hear from you guys. So sorry, I don't mean to like take over here. But the film it's very cleverly programmed, you know, with colors and shadows, the Greek film, because that's also an older gent going back in memory. But it's a very different treatment of what memory is. It's also really about like memory versus versus time. Like going back in time is not the same thing as going back in memory.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sort of really curious to hear what you guys have to what your response was to that film.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I was wondering if you were going to bring it up, because I was going to, based on what you were saying about specifically, I like what you said about the idea of experience and how our experience of our lives or memories gets translated into a filmic experience. And yeah, I mean, I feel like this film is what kind of struck me about it in terms of what you're talking about in dealing with memory also goes back to like ideas about what, like the cinematic function of what capturing an image is and preserving it as some kind of record, and how the record of a certain time in a certain place that a film might capture, especially if you think of it as like in the documentary mode of capturing reality, whatever that can be construed as, and then having it as something to look back on as evidence of that moment, especially if it's a moment like in your life, something that's personal to you. And I think a lot of experimental films do play with those ideas, because it's always an open question as to what the relationship is between an image and reality, especially now when the manipulations that we can do to an image are sort of infinite, and I think this is maybe getting into like a broader question of like the idea now, I think, and where we're really sort of in a time in history, both film history and world history, where we're sort of distrustful of images, or questioning like whether images themselves can be trustworthy or whether they're even legible to us, and whether or not we can try to find that now, or like how we find it. And so I kept thinking about those kind of things with this film, although of course in the film it is situated within a very personal story for this man and kind of the struggle that he's going through. But I think it's interesting how like those bigger ideas are sort of connected to the structure of the film and kind of what it's exploring, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Well, and I'm glad you brought up the concept of it being this film. I'm going to bring up the slide here again. Not only being about him discussing memories, but then he also gets into filmmaking, that he would go around and record things. Right. And there was one part where he was saying something to the effect of people might think that, what's being captured is just the shadows of what was there, but actually what remains is the original. And to kind of meditate on the technique of filmmaking when we're talking about actual film and the light exposing it, and how that's capturing it and preserving it, but it's also like a duplication. The other thing too, even if we get into just digital filmmaking, the fact that motion pictures, and sorry, I'm trying to connect this also to the point that you had earlier, that film is just like essentially 24 frames per second, or 29.97 if we want to be specific. And so it's not really true. It is in its nature a manipulation, that it's not real life. It's essentially a flip book. And then even the sound physically cannot be recorded as the same thing. You have an audio track and you have the video track. So it's fascinating to step back, not only from this film, but from the whole program. And I'll thank you for pointing it out, of this kind of overarching theme of storytelling and memory and preservation and capturing it, whether it's through film or any other medium. Really fascinating.
Yes, sorry, I interrupted, and I should have warned you guys earlier that I come from India. We do this all the time. We speak over each other, so not to be
it's all good.
No, but I want to that is what really struck me about that film. That the film, the fact that it sort of references this gentleman's own experience with making movies in the past, and sort of gets into that and gets him to hold the camera again, and then like cuts into movies that he had shot, is a really strong. It's more than a reference. I think it's really, the filmmaker is really trying to tell us about the democracy of cinema, which experimental film as a genre has always struggled for since the beginning. Because since the beginning of the film industry, there's been a parallel movement of experimental cinema, which has always tried to make this medium the medium for the masses. You know, you could buy, in the 60s, you could buy you could buy a roll of film at Walgreens for, you know, a $1.50 and go make a movie at home. Everybody had a film. Every human being has a film, possibly, potentially, and that is the cinema, you know. And what we are seeing in the movie theaters is something else. It's candy. Maybe we can talk about the candy film, talk about pharmaceutical drugs, because that's what we're being fed through the film industry. And really what we're taking is the homebrew of a cinema at home. You know, films belong in people's attics, on their dining tables. You know, films are to be made on dining tables, not in a big studio.
I love that quote. Films are to be made on dining tables. So true.
I mean, that's where Spielberg started. That's what he said.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and it's tricky because I feel like pre-internet, the experimental film movement is kind of in the same vein of like punk rock, you know, where it's a true, authentic, freedom of expression. But now, and not saying the internet's a bad thing, although that could be a whole different discussion, but everybody has access to learning how to operate a camera and edit stuff. Everybody has some kind of recording device, exactly, whether it's your phone or something else. Every single person can make a movie, however you want to justify what is. I mean, even a GIF that's like looping pictures, it's a movie, you know? And so you have people making just stuff that's no longer that true expression or capturing reality in all of its wholesomeness. Now everything feels like it's pulling from, you know, the inspiration of Hollywood. And do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? It feels like it's lost its art form, and it feels like experimental films as we knew them is maybe being threatened. I don't know. What are thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I don't know. I mean, I think I'm fundamentally against sort of compartmentalizing cinema in these sort of modes of experimental and narrative and fiction, because they're ultimately sort of ways of simply marketing them. And really, I mean, film as a medium has no real boundaries, you know. I think that the medium has had to, in the hands of, you know, artists, in the hand of artisanal filmmakers, has had to sort of suffer. And I mean, they're, you know, independent cinema, you know, I mean, it's well known that filmmakers back in the day, I mean, they would like load up their films in the back of their car and go from one university campus to another and show these films in auditoriums and in people's basements and so forth. But I don't know, I'm hopeful on one hand that now digital sort of platforms online people are able to distribute films more democratically. And yet, it's worthy of. I mean, I'm saddened that the minute YouTube becomes, for example, popular, the industry immediately kind of comes and takes over, and then people find something else. Now, then there's TikTok, and there's something else. You know, I mean, the masses still crave to sort of be independent of commercialization, but the sort of power of the industry is always, in the end, you know, mightier. But the medium has survived 150 years. I think it'll keep going, and it is when the social reality sort of intersects with the technical, you know, sort of possibilities that the true innovation really happens. I mean, in a way, cinema itself is experimental. I mean, the very idea of cinema is experimental. We don't we don't have a conversation over the dining table in terms of medium close-ups and close-ups and these 180-degree rules and all that stuff that we teach in film schools. I mean, we have these very fluid conversations. We go from one thought to another. So why can't film sort of be about the same kind of fluidity? Why can't film like jump just like a dream does, or a stream of consciousness type conversation does? Am I taking your conversation way too outside now?
No, I love it. I love it so much.
Experimental cinema. So why not?
No, yeah, I think that everything you're saying is you made a number of good points, and I feel like Sarah's idea about the threat that's there, I think you really pointed to, which is that no matter where cinema goes, and even if you're talking about cinema outside of film, because I think the idea of something like TikTok being cinema is really interesting, because I feel like in many ways you can make a legitimate argument for the idea that so much of what is being done now, like that's super creative, or is like teenagers on TikTok, and that the freedom that they have to do what they want on that platform is fostering a certain level of like creativity. And I feel like no matter where movies kind of go, you always are going to have, like Anil said, the looming shadow of the industry that's going to be peeking its head out to see what can be monetized, And I said, like, that's sort of inevitable. And I mean, that goes back to what Sarah said about punk rock. I mean, punk rock originally as a sort of counter to the mainstream or whatever, of course, in the end gets co-opted by the industry, and then it becomes its own fashion. I mean, this is just a cycle that repeats itself as long as all of these art forms are just being as long as they exist within the sphere of like commercial production or around it, of just them being capitalist products. So I think that really it's just about whether or not people are willing to sort of make things that resist that, or try to function within it while not capitulating to the demands of like the market or of profit or of trying to have the art form purely exist as like a product, But the idea of these things as like you were saying, as almost like a narcotic or something, and speaking to like the idea of like the candy shop film, which is one that I believe was given a juror prize at the festival. This is, a film that my own personal reaction to it was not super positive, just in the sense that I think the film is striking on its face as an act of editing, because obviously you can look at this, say, like all of the pills and the candy and the syringes that were shot probably frame by frame. This is like a feat in terms of time and effort to create, right? But I also feel like judging a work of art by the amount of hours that went into it is kind of problematic in many ways. But also I feel like, I don't know, I look at this and I feel like this is trying to offer a critique essentially with the idea that we, I guess, generally are we're a society overly dependent on pharmaceuticals, and that there's an easy sort of parallel to be made between popping pills and popping warhead candies or things like this. But for me, I don't know, maybe it's the moment in time that we're in, especially with the pandemic, but I look at this and I think most of the drugs that are probably featured in this film are antidepressants, probably, or are drugs that are meant, as much as we could get into the ideas of how this is also a profit-driven industry, but is meant to help people deal with mental illness. And the fact that the film includes, I believe, sections with birth control. And the idea that it's conflating these things with the idea that we're just like popping these things because we're addicted to them or something, I find that a very problematic association. I don't think that it's really thought through that well. So that was my reaction to Candy Shop.
That's super interesting, Spencer, your response to it. I saw the film very differently. In my first sort of viewing of it, I was really thinking of the sound and image relationship, how the whole film is played to this sort of, very loose, laid back kind of a drum, a cyclical kind of drum beat. And I was just thinking that, and it was syncing so beautifully, and I was thinking that it's not that the image is syncing to the sound, it's my brain syncing the image to the sound, because I guarantee you, if we had like changed the time on the timeline, like if we had moved the soundtrack a little bit forward or backward, even by a frame or 10 frames, it still would have synced in our brain. And it's sort of our own desire to sync image and sound, because that's how we sort of experience the world, you know, typically in sync. And so that was one. But to your point, I mean, it made me think when I noticed in the production credits that the filmmaker acknowledged the Addiction Council, or some kind of, you know, a body. The film was either sponsored or by some kind of addiction research, and that just sort of made me think that, oh, I mean, maybe the film is in its own subtle, playful, perhaps even way, referencing, you know, I mean, now we're in the pandemic, but I mean, let's not forget that we're also in the middle of a major opioid crisis in this country.
Right.
And I mean, it is well known that the pharmaceutical industry, like the film industry, has a pretty big hold on our lives, you know. But if I may, sorry, you know, if I may, I want to sort of go back to that earlier conversation and bring up the deep hole, because here's a film where the filmmaker sort of goes back into the archives and now really sort of reclaims footage that was shot, if not for an outright commercial purpose, certainly some kind of an educational or some kind of a documentary purpose. I mean, there was clearly some other intention with the original footage. I mean, not to mention the sort of Christian networks and, you know, religion and all that. But what I'm interested is more into how a filmmaker within the realm of experimental cinema can really subvert images and really sort of reconstruct images into a very interesting, curious kind of story, and critique several things in society at the same time.
Well, with that one, you know, of course, I'm skeptical of it right off the bat. And so I just hop right on Google and I'm like digging into this, like, do they really have a recording of hell? Like, what am I missing? And it's interesting to learn that this whole story is, you know, folklore. It's a bogus story that was passed around quite a bit. And it's fascinating to think of the time period that they're focusing on here when it was told and this information was getting out there. And you do have churches that were using that potential like recording of hell to, you know, push their point. And then you compare it to what we know as fake news and misinformation now. And it seems like two radically different things because one of them is more politicized than anything, but it's really what it is. And I'm so glad the point was brought up of how this program is really curated around storytelling and information and sharing, you know, the dissemination of stories, we'll say. And so this one getting into that misinformation from a different era is really fascinating.
Yeah, I think that I love that you said that, because I think it goes back to the kind of idea I mentioned earlier about like the legibility or trustworthiness of images. But in this case, it's about sound more so. And we see within the film that the way that the recording, so-called, of hell is being deployed through certain channels for a certain use, right? But that use is determined by its interpretation, which is that it is a real record of the existence of hell within like the center of the earth, right? And that we have scientific factual proof because it was recorded. And I think that one of the things that's so clever about the film is, as a documentary, it's questioning that idea of that thing, that recording, as a document of something that's real, or something that can be used to reveal the truth or something about the world. And this is an interesting film too, because it's not incredibly like abstract or challenging as a film in terms of an experimental documentary. I mean, it has a narrator, it has chapter breaks, you know, it's structured in a way that we are sort of familiar with, but there's that like self-aware quality to it, where it's thinking about this subject and how this is being deployed, that makes you kind of, I mean, I identify with what Sarah was saying about how I'm watching this film, and the entire time I'm sort of questioning not just the subject matter, but I'm questioning the film itself. I'm questioning the techniques, and I'm also questioning where it's going to go. But I think one of the most canny things about it is that it does not let you hear the recording until like the end, until the very end, which I love, because it builds up all of these various expectations and levels of interpretation for you to hold in your mind at once, so that when you get to actually hear it, you have that kind of baggage with you. Whereas if you heard it earlier on in the film and you only had one of those interpretations or one of those contexts, it would be less complicated, you know? I also love the fact that it's just like the source of the sound is from like an old splatter film from like the 70s or something, which I think is just a really beautiful idea connected to like, you know, sort of independent, like trashy cinema.
I want to bring into the conversation a couple of other things. I mean, one of them, you know, a point I wanted to sort of make earlier is that another characteristic that I really admire and appreciate in experimental films is this idea of making films within a community. I mean, so Raji's film in Sri Lanka is really sort of conceived in collaboration with the community where it's shot, you know, and again, that's another sort of democratic approach to filmmaking. Same thing where you know, the film, you know, the Greek film is really sort of made in collaboration with the main actor. It's very clear in the film. And then now coming back to Mac McCormick's, you know, film, it's made within the sort of Northwest Film Collective. I mean, they have a really strong film community out in the Northwest, in the Pacific Northwest of America. Matt himself used to run an amazing film festival called the PDX Film Festival out of Portland, Oregon, where Miranda July and a lot of artists, you know, come out of there. Vanessa Rennick is another one. A lot of them are regulars at the Ann Arbor Film Festival, you know, have been for years. But it's such an important aspect in terms of saving, nurturing, cultivating a culture of experimental cinema, to have a community that supports it. So I really kind of, you know, yet another shout out to Ann Arbor Film Festival for and to Wellesley Theater and Grand Rapids Public Library to do something like this, because we need more films like this. Craig Baldwin really comes to mind. Also, this filmmaker out of San Francisco who, you know, back in the day, I mean, he used to like just fish out all these films out of like dumpsters. I mean, you know, people were like schools and everybody was like throwing away films when video was first like, you know, discovered, and started sort of making these seemingly documentary like highly fictitious kind of stories out of found footage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Matt's film The Deep Hole is you know, yet another sort of example. I highly recommend one of his earliest films. I can't remember the exact title. I think it's called The Subversive Art of Graffiti Removal. Yeah, I think. Graffiti removal. I mean, he's just kind of mastered his own style there, where it's like this narrated film that is very, very. It really deceives you into thinking that this is all real, and I think there is yet another trope of experimental cinema is where it really leads the viewer into thinking that, into this kind of suspended disbelief, you know, idea, until it starts kind of subverting that very, very slowly and gently. And I want to like, you know, somebody remind me, what was the first film that is in the program?
The Tetlali.
Yeah, like that, or the Golden Legend, like the Spanish film. I mean, that is like, you know, as Buñuel-esque as you can get. I mean, it's no coincidence that it's a Spanish film, because it's as if like somebody's just like creating a documentary at this place. But then it slowly starts sinking in. The whole thing is a construct. I thought it was a brilliant film. You know, I want to say that was like my second most favorite film in the program.
The Golden Legend, you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, it's an unforgettable film.
Yeah, I would say it's probably my favorite of these in this program, and it was one of my favorites when I was watching the festival, you know, the stream last year. It immediately stuck out to me, and I mean, one of the reasons I think is that it's another one of those ones that we mentioned earlier where it's sort of playing with narrative somewhat. It's kind of there's sort of maybe another, we could say, like a novel, like a trope of experimental filmmaking, where sometimes an experimental film's narrative is more like creating an atmosphere or an environment where all of these things are allowed to kind of hang together kind of loosely. And in this film, it's more like a single location. It's this public pool. And so you don't really have any protagonists or characters. You just get glimpses of these people and these situations that are kind of centered around this place. But you're so right. I mean, the establishment of the setting feels sort of everyday and sort of natural at first. But then there are these little kind of cues that pop up that kind of throw you off. And then you get some real strange things. I mean, when you see like the green ooze that's coming out of the window, like the bathroom window, and the kids are like going around in it, you're like, oh, okay. And then there's just all of these kind of these signals that something's off, and they sort of get more and more menacing almost. That something else is kind of going on here, like when the woman is taking the picture of the like Baphomet and goat head figure in the book and these things, and it's like, okay, there's something else going on here under the surface of what's being presented to us, which is this like beautiful sunny day at the pool. And then it culminates in what like the shot here has that we have on the screen, which is where a man literally walks on the water of the pool to save this man who's nearly drowning. And by that point, you're thrown for a total loop, and now you know that what you thought you knew about this place is totally different.
I mean, he resurrects him from the dead, and the can offer him water just after he's like drowned. Yeah, it's brilliant, and I think it's a beautiful. I mean, if for the audiences, if I highly recommend Buñuel's Las Verdes, like the Land of the Bread, which is this other. I mean, I think this is like a kind of a critique of anthropology in a way. I mean, it's a critique of ethnography, of looking at society and looking at the curious creatures that we are with all our leisure and beliefs and I mean it's speak about artificial intelligence. I mean, this film. I mean, if anything, I think this is the film that really is made by an artificial intelligence, including the humankind in a different way.
Yeah.
I want to jump back to a point, Spencer, that you made about the golden legend of that you have these kind of weird things that pop up, and at first it's a little jarring, like the ooze coming out of the bathroom, like, okay, are we going to go sci-fi? Like, is that what's going on? Like, I'm waiting for it. And then it just kind of keeps going. Like, it's not a big deal. There's just green ooze. Just don't worry about it. But when you think about this, as you said, by the time we get to the part where this person is walking on water and saving someone's life, it doesn't even really faze you that he's walking on water. And it's fascinating because it does the same thing that the first, 10 minutes of a standard feature film does of world building. And you start to understand and accept maybe the magic of the world, if it's something fantasy, you know what I mean? That you have this entire film that lacks a lot of dialogue. I mean, you have these little vignettes with people talking, but it's not the same as the protagonist in a linear narrative. Mm-hmm. And even though it's a pretty non-linear style story, you still accept the world and get into it, and it's that suspense of disbelief. And it's just fascinating that this film, which it's like, 10 minutes long, can pull you in, and by the end you're just like, yeah, okay, this is that world, I get it.
Yeah, I feel like it's, whether you're talking about a more experimental film or whether it is a more classically made kind of a narrative film, oftentimes, and someone maybe said this maybe should be a quote that's attributed to somebody, but like the best ones teach you how to watch them. Like as you're entered into a film and it shows you its own kind of language and it's showing you its moves, it is kind of teaching you how to watch it. And that's by like you say, like setting up expectations, getting you accustomed to characters or settings and things like that. And yeah, I totally agree. This one was a perfect example of doing that. Because even the disruptions or the things that throw you off, while they are disruptive and they may be surprising in a certain way, they feel of a piece. They feel of a piece with the world that the filmmakers have crafted because it is so kind of seamlessly constructed together. And also, I think even before that event, that sort of like miracle, if you want to call it that, there are these kind of intimations of some kind of like spiritual presence or some kind of like mystical quality, because there's that like ritual that the kids are performing with the diamond, and there's other little cues that pop up that inform you that the universe of this film, however it is comprised, maybe has these elements to it, you know. But again, it's just these little bits that it kind of feeds you as you go along, so that by the time you get to that point, it does feel sort of natural, unnaturally natural.
Mm-hmm. No, to get back to a point that we had earlier about us as moviegoers kind of unconsciously looking for a story or a pattern or something so that you can feel satisfied when it happens. Like, oh, I knew that, I don't know, that couple was going to get together or something like that. It's very rewarding with storytelling. With this one, I kept writing down the things that were kind of occult feeling of, okay, are we going to get like sci-fi or like witchcrafty or, you know, what's going to go on? Because in the beginning, you had a story about a sheep eating a guy's face. Then you have, I think it was the lady singing the song about the daughter being mutilated by her parents. And then you have the image of the Baphomet and so on and so forth that we talked about. Were you guys, when you were watching this, were you kind of trying to piece something together and make an occult style story out of it? Or did you just let go and say, Jesus, take the wheel, let's see what happens?
I would say that, well, there's also the fact that the film opens with another story about a man who's claiming that the end of the world is coming. You know, so really right from the beginning, the context is like apocalyptic in some sense. But I would say for myself, not really, other than the fact that I was starting to see this, I guess you would say maybe darkness kind of creeping in. And of course, knowing that it's an experimental film and that it's probably not going to maybe, you know, conform to any conventional narrative arc, I was eager to see where it would go, I suppose. But other than that, I was just so taken by these inferences and references, you know, whether it was through the images or the objects that were being kind of peppered in there.
Mm-hmm. And Noel, what about you? What was your experience?
I'm trying to recall what my experience was, and because of, you know, like any film, I'm also sort of caught up in the moment to moment progression of the film, and I'm not really sort of putting things together until later. I think, like most films, you know, whether it's this or any other film, my general instinctive response to a film is always light. You know, it's always light, then it's movement, then it's images that sort of form into images that have references in my own sort of universe of references. You know, history, geography, anthropology. You know, the whole gamut. Or within the film world itself. But that's a much later thought usually. Like even when I was talking earlier about this particular film and drawing on Buñuel, that's a much later thought about, you know, that's it's a reflection. It's not the experience of the film at that time. And to that, I mean, I think it's amusing to me that you know, I mean, in true experimental fashion, we are talking about this program in the reverse order. We started with the last film and we're working our way back.
That's true.
Just like an experimental film would resist like linear narrativity, we're going backwards. I want to bring in the first film because I mean, so who is it in cinema? You know, Kuleshov, I mean, you know, tells you that like one image and I mean, two images create like a third meaning. I mean, that's like your basic editing theory. And I think that this film has a kind of dialogue with the first film because they're in progression. You know, you see this sort of, I don't want to say, I'm not sure if it's certainly not an Iranian film, though, even though the music is Persian and the musician is Persian. I think it's a Mexican film and probably shot in a landscape there, somewhere in sort of the Californias of Mexico or something. But anyway, it doesn't matter. I mean, I want to talk about this idea of a film that is atmospheric, which responds to light, landscape, and I'm curious, like, if there's a dialogue between this film and the Golden, not the Golden Pond, the Golden Legend. But if not, it certainly has a dialogue with the Candy film in the way again, how it's really about sound and image and that sort of relationship. But I mean, you know, the film is all the things that we experience in it. So I'm curious, like, what your experiences are.
Spencer, you want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I hadn't thought about that connection before, but you bringing it up strikes me as this film Tetlayi, despite the fact that it lacks, again, a sort of arc, to me there seems to be this sort of presence of that the musician is a character, and that the performance of this music is existing in this atmosphere of this space, but that there is some kind of journey, at least a journey that's maybe unknown to us, but that he is sort of experiencing or going on. And there is an element, maybe however vague, at least I felt, of either spirituality or some kind of transcendent experience. So I feel like there's maybe a connection there. But in terms of the sort of imagery, I thought it was interesting that one of the things that I thought kind of cues you into that is that you have these huge wide landscape shots of, like you're talking about, like this mountainous region, but then also what the filmmaker has done is every once in a while has inserted these shots that they have like a symmetrical filter on them. And so the center of the frame has the two halves split in the exact same way. It's a very simple effect, and it's simple both to do and to sort of see how it works. But when you have these incredible sort of natural images of the landscape, and then you cut to this one that's so unnatural, to me it had this sort of, there was almost like a slightly psychedelic kind of element that was kind of going on there. But again, I was associating it with like the perspective of that character, or like the subjectivity. Like I was sort of filtering my experience of what I was seeing through him, which again that was my experience, and you could watch the film in another way. But the way that the shape of the film was sort of informing me, that's how I kind of took it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I responded similarly as well. Whereas I thought, although I thought that the symmetry in the composition, you know, even in the way not just the filter, but even in other compositions where the character was placed in the frame, was the kind of progression of the film, and the asymmetry in the end is the kind of climax of the film. The film is really going from sort of symmetry to asymmetry in this very sort of, in its own sort of logical way, and that also includes not just the balance, not just the way the frame is arranged, but also in the way the other elements are introduced, you know, whether it's mist or water or rocks, or, you know, so from a certain kind of hardness to a softness and back to, you know, so yeah, I mean, it was interesting in that, and I loved the way the film sort of evoked images, evoked kind of a longing for travel, a longing for you know, other lands, other, you know, realities, you know, other landscapes than what we might normally be used to, in many ways, not just musically, but visually as well. So that was, for me, a really strong point in the film.
Yeah.
I think my favorite thing about whether I'm part of a panel like this or just sitting in on them, and I wish more and more people would take part in these kind of discussions, is being able to hear everyone else's experiences and perspectives. And yes, you know, you might watch a standard comedy movie and there's not really too many different ways to take it, but with such a high art form as experimental films, I think it's crucial to hear the different perspectives and be able to appreciate that piece of art in several different ways and understand that it can be understood in different ways. And I love the perspective that you guys have on this particular film. And for me, and this could just be from, you know, my own like recent influences, just like somebody of a different culture might interpret it different. And that goes for any movie. But with this one, since meditation has been a pretty prominent buzzword really for this year of mindfulness and meditation, I took this one as a very meditative piece, but specifically music meditation. And a friend of mine, Hayes Griffin, he's been posting these music meditation tips of like, okay, if you got a guitar, just strum this string and kind of like get lost in that note. And that's what I was doing with this movie. And even with this shot in particular, not only was I trying to get lost in the music because it would be a shot of him playing the instrument and then kind of cut to this imagery. And so I'm thinking this is kind of where his mind is going as he's visualizing the music. But then you also have the beautiful soundscaping that's going on. And with this shot in particular, you have a low earthy rumble, but it's also kind of dark and ominous. Is there something evil? Is that maybe an evil, anxious thought creeping up while he's meditating? I think there's so many ways that you could take it, but overall just a beautiful film and really, really fascinating to think about.
Sarah, it's really interesting that you bring up meditation in reference to this film, and I want to sort of, I was just thinking that the only place where the term meditation appears in my notes, as I was watching these films, is the last film, the Greek film, and I thought it was a beautiful meditation on mortality and memory. And that everything sort of in the end, it ends. Ultimately, just as that program kind of ends, at that with that film. But if you think about meditation, I mean, if meditation is something that we do where we cease to listen to our thoughts and instead sort of engage in a reality that is outside of our sort of cause and effect kind of thought processes, then isn't all cinema a meditation? Like isn't that what cinema does basically to us, where we lose ourselves, we lose our conscious kind of, in that we might think about these films later on consciously, but in those moments we are outside of ourselves completely, and there couldn't be a better genre than experimental filmmaking in that sense, which is respectful of that very process in its audiences.
I love that thought that all cinema is a form of meditation. And if that's true, I'm going to tell my therapist, you said meditate, I'm watching movies, I'm doing the right thing, right? But that's such a beautiful way to put it, because it really is. It's, not only like a suspense of disbelief, but you're kind of detaching from your own world. It's escapism. And that can be what meditation is too. It can be cathartic. It can be just, getting away from the day-to-day stuff.
Well, I mean, think about it. In the old days, we went to church and we looked at this beautiful stained glass, window which emanated light upon us. And in that sermon, we lost, we now were engaged in a higher kind of experience than our daily lives. And that's what the movie hall does. We go and sit in a dark room and we look up at this brilliant light that is emanating from, the front. And we are now engaged with a different kind of light.
I love that so much. The Church of Movies. I'm so into it. Sign me up. All right. Now, I know we are just over an hour here, and I know we've just had a very beautiful conversation, and I feel like this might pivot it in a totally different direction, but I feel like we have to talk about the one movie we haven't mentioned yet, which is the Vertigo AI, and I'm really curious to hear what you two think, and I feel like I have a different appreciation for it after this conversation, but let's hear it. What did you guys think?
Yeah, I was going to make a joke, something about like what would happen if a machine meditated on a film.
This might be it.
This is literally what you get, because that's what the filmmaker did. For me, this one, I was really taken with this one for a number of reasons. One, I think that the actual idea of how it was made is interesting. I think that our artificial intelligence or computer generated imagery or films is interesting in the sense that there's a certain element to it where the filmmaker has set up the machine or the computer to do something and it does it. So there's a spontaneity and like an improvisation to it, and you get the results. that you get. And I think that the images in this film are really striking in that they resemble almost like an abstract impressionist painting that's moving. And of course, I think, your relationship to watching this film is going to depend heavily on your familiarity with the film Vertigo, the Hitchcock film, and how much you sort of maybe are aware of not just what it looks like and the images in it, but what it's about. But I feel like when, to kind of go back to what we were talking about the idea of memory, this computer has watched Vertigo 20 times and has now produced its own sort of memory of this film. And I love the way that I just love the texture of it, for one. The fact that Jimmy Stewart's face has been morphed into this almost like cubist formation thing, and the play with some of the more abstract sequences of color and texture are just wonderful. But I think it's fascinating too that, for me, I personally love Vertigo. It's one of my favorite Hitchcock films. I think that its reputation as this sort of almost endless film that you can sort of get lost in, and it's a deceptively simple film where there's so much more going on within it, is really fascinating and I think true. And for me, listening to the narration of this film, which this computer, I guess, generated because of the dialogue, was so fascinating because so much of it is sort of both banal and meaningless, but at the same time, there are these bits of it which do speak to some of the really, like, what I find profound things about the film, and especially a lot of the more darker undercurrents of it, in terms of it being about obsession and images and wanting to kind of recreate the world or a person the way you want it to be recreated in. So I don't know, I took this almost as if someone wanted to make a video essay analyzing Vertigo, except they did it in a purely like poetic mode, except also filtered through a machine, which gives it this odd coldness, in a sense. But Vertigo is also a cold film in some ways. There is that element. So I don't know, the way that this film relates to its source material, I found really fascinating. And that also gets back to the idea that we were talking about earlier of the relationship between an experimental film and its source or its archive material. In this case, it's a Hitchcock film, not like a recording of hell or something. But I was really fascinated by that relationship in this one.
I think the one thing it certainly shares with Hitchcock, although I think of Hitchcock as a whole different sort of, kind of filmmaker, is that like Hitchcock, it's a very clever film, and like Hitchcock, it's a film that keeps you guessing. But Hitchcock has a very, very different purpose in keeping you guessing. Hitchcock is making films in the specific genre of a suspense, type film. While here's a film that I might just be dumb. I might be the dumbest person on the planet, but I did not feel like I really got the film very much. Besides its basic premise, I mean, there was nothing outside of that basic premise that the film was watched by a computer 20 times, and then this was the sort of a pastiche or an amalgamation or whatever the term might be for that kind of a mashup of images and sounds. Beyond that, so then what? And then if I'm not getting it, am I that dumb? And I don't like films that make me feel like I'm not intelligent enough to experience the film and bring my own sort of life experience into the film. I mean, I think in that, I mean, sometimes it can be. I mean, you see a Jean-Luc Godard film, and it makes you feel like that. But then there's so much that he's giving you that you have to think about. That you have to see the film like 50 times again to kind of try and get underneath those layers, But somebody like Godard has 50 years of experimenting with the medium, so he can have those 50 layers of in a contemporary film that he makes, because he's been he's the first person that made a jump cut in a movie. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I mean, coming back to Chris Peters' film, and I mean, I mean, Chris Peters is a really good friend, so I was happy to see. I finally saw his work. I'd never ever seen. I'd heard a lot about his work, but I'd never actually seen it. So I was very, very happy to see his work. But it wasn't my favorite film in the program. Let me just put it that way, for the reasons I gave.
Yeah. I mean, I think that part of the maybe immediate appeal of it is, as an experiment that was given over to the machine to see what would happen, which I think is maybe a newer sort of subgenre of experimental filmmaking. You're seeing this more and more where people are using AI or algorithms to do that. So I think like that's maybe one of the immediate appeals, but
certainly, and that's not a new love that experimental cinemas had for the idea of. I mean, there's I get that. I mean, to be more fair to the film, I really enjoyed the film visually. I just did not want to be constantly processing a narration along with those images that were so seductive in their own way. Like, had the film just been left as this visual experience, I would have had a very, very different response. But my senses were being tried because I had to like process the text, make meaning out of the text, the narration, and connect it to the images. And that was not happening for me.
Yeah. That's interesting, because I feel like for me, I felt similarly, and then I was sort of overwhelmed by it, especially the narration, and how abstract or dense the narration gets, it becomes a lot to handle. But I feel like while I was watching it, I was sort of conscious of the fact that this was a computer that came up with this, and so it's mostly nonsense. But then when there were these moments where nonsense became almost a very clear picture of some kind of theme or moment in the film that I remember, then it was, I don't know, there's almost like a part of it to me that's maybe an unintentional joke, where it's like even a computer would understand Vertigo because it's such like a masterpiece or something, but I felt like it was almost as if what's handed over to us by the filmmaker is just a bunch of noise, essentially, and that these little bits of static and noise, and then the bits of clarity that poke through it are what I sort of grabbed onto, and was like, wow, that's sort of wild that this came out of something that would maybe seem so random, but would speak to this film that people have been, kind of talking about for decades.
And that was the sort of added responsibility that the film sort of gave to me, is to then, after all that, I mean, here was like, you're processing the film, which is kind of not exactly the easiest film to process, and now you have to connect it to everything that Vertigo and Hitchcock and that in real time for me was a little too much to ask. And this also now, I mean, we're sort of coming back full circle, which is wonderful. That it in a way, I mean, now that I'm rethinking this film, it's a really amazing film because it plays with our desire for story again. It's playing with our desire to construct story, expect stories in movies, which Hitchcock was a master of. Yeah. And it's no wonder that Chris Peters takes a Hitchcock film and then abstracts it through artificial intelligence. And then like, hey, now what do you have in terms of story or expectations or suspense?
It's interesting too to think of it as kind of a commentary on the distaste for Hollywood, because so many people think that it's just, you have an equation for a story, plug in these pieces, and you got a movie. Yeah. And we know that's not true. It takes a lot more than that. But you would almost think, oh, Hitchcock is classic, so there must be a pretty traditional structure or some kind of equation to this that anybody could repeat it, right? So I like to think about this movie as a challenge to that, saying, well, look, at a computer watched it 20 times and he still can't recreate it. So I had sort of a love-hate thing with this movie. And I think Anul's point of what if it didn't have that narration, because I kept getting pulled out of it and wanted to just get lost in the visuals and like not even necessarily find the story of Vertigo in there, but just kind of see what happened with it. But I don't know, I kind of do appreciate how jarring it was to have the narration that's a bit discombobulated with, as Spencer said, the little pockets of like, oh yes, that's spot on, that's exactly it. And so it's neat because it takes you out of the traditional like film watching experiences to get lost in it. And I feel like a lot of experimental films do the opposite, that they're always calling attention to, hey, you're watching a movie, check this out, like you're paying attention to this technique. So it It's interesting. I think the other thing, too, that really stood out to me was it made me think of this image that I'd just seen online of somebody was doing like brain scans on patients that they were shown an image, take it away, show an image, and then they had to recall that in their head. And they had this technology to show what that looked like. And it looked a lot like these images that you have kind of the blurs. You don't have the definition and, you know, the facial features, things like that. But you have the general shapes and positions and some colors start to come in. So I was kind of thinking of it that way of like, is this as though you watched Vertigo and then you had a dream of the entire movie?
Yeah.
You know, that it's there.
Yeah, exactly. It's a machine dream trying to recall this, which I think is interesting in the sense too of it as, again, going back to a major theme maybe of this program of like memory. And like Anil said, I mean, this filmmaker could have chosen any film to run through this computer, right? So why is Vertigo specifically so kind of rich for this? And I think one of the things again is that like that film itself is about memory in some ways, although it is a very disturbing kind of story about memory, but specifically about the way that memories are or can be distorted or willingly distorted depending on our own desires. And so then when you have the film that's trying to be remembered by a computer that becomes distorted and transformed in this thing, I don't know, there's an odd parallel there where it's almost like there's almost like a relatability between our own maybe memories of trying to recall a film like Vertigo, which is sort of strange and elusive despite its classical nature, and the way that the computer has kind of done this similar process.
That's I mean, this conversation can really, I mean, I'm actually really fascinated the amount of dialogue that this film is actually generating, or all the various directions that this film is sort of making us go into. Because now, based on what you're saying, Spencer, I'm thinking that you know, like film as Hitchcock knew it was a celluloid finite medium. I mean, you know, it was a medium that was ultimately going to disintegrate, you know, by its own sort of chemical composition.
Yeah.
And so really what we know as Vertigo is really in our collective memory, and many times that we've kind of visited this film as a cult classic, as like students of cinema, as professors of cinema and so forth, while a film like Chris Peters, or what it references, is really now into the realm of digital memory. And like what is that difference between analog and digital? One is a meditation on mortality, the other one is this kind of humanity's desire for immortality. And now maybe the digital medium is the answer, that the machines will outlive us. Like somehow our history will live on, you know, for some future intelligence to discover us.
Yeah.
And hopefully they'll discover Ann Arbor Film Festival, and hopefully this little program that we're doing.
You know, but the thing is, Anil, that's a really neat point of analyzing analog as a form of memory versus digital, and analog being a material that's going to disintegrate at some point. It's just going to happen.
Like the rest of us.
Yeah, exactly. But even digital, circling back to some points we made earlier, can be manipulated and won't be the honest archive of what it was, whether it's, you know, in the realm of like deep fakes or something's just edited so it comes off with a different message. You can't totally trust it. So, man, there's a lot to think about. I think that we've concluded a lot of fascinating things about this whole program, and I don't think I would have had the same appreciation, not only for the individual films, but just seeing it as a bigger picture without what both of you guys have said of tying it together with these underlying themes of story and memory and archiving, and, you know, all of that is just really fascinating. And I feel like it's not necessarily a happy accident that these films came together that way. I think the people at Ann Arbor Film Festival are just a wonderful bunch of people and very intelligent, and they know what they're doing, and they know you'd throw this together and we'd have an hour and 20-minute discussion on, 7 short films?
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
I know, that's the thing, is that like these awards programs are pulled from those that won awards. So there's a limited pool of selection, and there's 2 awards programs. So these aren't carefully programmed as much as any other program in the festival is, you know. And there is some kind of curatorial logic to how it's placed together. Yeah.
I think they did a fantastic job with this one. And I mean, I personally haven't been disappointed by any programs yet, but I think this one has really surprised me with some of those themes that kind of come out as you look at it as a whole too. And hopefully it makes you appreciate the other films more. Maybe as a standalone, it's not quite as strong as when it's paired with a theme, you know what I mean? So yet another way that you can appreciate a film, like I said earlier, being part of these discussions, whether you're actually part of the dialogue or just observing it, I think is really important for not just filmmakers and creatives, but everybody. You know, it's a part of media literacy, a part of like a cultural appreciation. And I am super thankful that the Grand Rapids Public Library gives us this opportunity to see these films. You know, not everyone can get over to Ann Arbor, or maybe they can't make it happen to stream the film festival. So to have this for free for people to watch and talk about and even make their own experimental films is just amazing. So shout out once again, Grand Rapids Public Library, specifically the Grand Rapids Public Library Foundation are the ones that funded this today. So if anyone watching or listening wants to check out more about the programs they have in this vein or otherwise, grpl.org. Not to mention, they've got things like Canopy. Are you guys familiar with that streaming platform?
Absolutely.
Amazing. And it's free with your library card. So many great resources, but I digress. Well, why don't we kind of wrap it up here? I think we've done a great job of pulling these movies apart and putting them back together in a different order. How about some recommendations? I know there might be some people listening or watching that are brand new to experimental filmmaking. So even if you have something that's a little easier to digest or something that's super deep cut, experimental, we're open to everything. Spencer, do you want to go first?
Sure. I guess I would say, I mean, that question just makes me think of one of the classes I teach, which is an intro course, and we touch on experimental filmmaking, and a lot of the things that I show in there are meant to kind of be an introduction, and some of them are a little more challenging and intense, but I guess I would name one that's if you know it, it's an obvious one because it is a stone cold classic, but Maya Deren's Meshes of the Afternoon. I mean, it's
so
one of the best ever. It's a personal favorite of mine, but most people who have seen it, I think, love it. But that film is such a brilliant encapsulation of so much of what makes experimental filmmaking, I think, special and interesting. It does have sort of a narrative somewhat, so it's an easier one to kind of present to somebody who's maybe just, dipping their toes into the ocean of the avant-garde. But it's also just an incredible work of editing and of cinematography and of acting even. And it's also, it's been referenced, and it's a part of popular culture too. So I think it's a film that maybe folks would even recognize things from, and it just has an endless life. So I would probably point people towards that as a start. All of her films really, but Meshes of the Afternoon is sort of the one.
That one is so good. I think tied for first place for Maya Deren films for me is At Land, just because I love the way she uses the camera and transitions to different locations is just really, really cool. So yes, Maya Deren, got to check her out for sure. Anil, what about you?
I mean, I would have said Maya Deren also if both of you hadn't, but I was thinking, just based on the last film from Greece, Colors and Shadows, it reminded me of the great Theo Angelopoulos. I hope I'm saying his name right, but Theo's film Eternity and a Day. So if you didn't catch the name, which I could never spell for you, like Angelopoulos. Eternity and a Day, I think, is a film that is a beautiful meditation, also sort of on mortality, and then based on Matt McCormick's film or found footage kind of filmmaking, I was thinking of Craig Baldwin's work is available, on YouTube and sort of in the public domain a little bit. He's a filmmaker based out of San Francisco, probably one of the most prolific sort of found footage type filmmakers. And then again, a name that I could spell for you, but it would take an hour for me to do that, is Apichatpong Virasattakul out of France.
Yes.
The youngest Asian filmmaker ever to win the Cannes Film Festival Award. But his body of work, which is pretty prolific, I think has, in some ways, like Raji in his film, might be paying a certain homage to Apichatpong. I was very, very excited to see that film.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I would say that too, especially if you're trying to think about filmmakers who are making like feature-length narrative films but are inserting experimental techniques into their films. I totally agree that Apichatpong is amazing. And the other one that I would mention too in that vein is an Argentine filmmaker named Lucrecia Martell, who only has, I think, 4 features to her name so far, but I think she's an absolute genius. And a film like The Headless Woman is one that she's made. Is, again, it's like it has a narrative, it has characters, but you've never seen a narrative film that deals with characters and story like this. And the way that she is able to create wholly unique films under her own style, and her use of sound especially, she's an incredible sound designer. Anytime I get a chance to plug Martell, I plug her, because I think she is just the best.
and since you bring up Argentinian filmmakers, I mean, I have to plug Lisandro Alonso.
Oh yeah,
Las Muertes.
Yep.
But I also wanted to, I mean, because most of us generally tend to see narrative films. Krzysztof Kieslowski, The Double Life of Veronique, is in very, very subtle ways, sort of breaking the narrative expectations and the story structure. And I think it's a very, I mean, apart from being an extremely sort of accessible film, it's also beautiful visually and otherwise.
Those are all fantastic recommendations. I know there's a couple in there that I have added to my watch list, which is constantly growing, but that's a good thing. My recommendations, I'm going to come at this in a totally different angle and from the short film perspective. I really love, as I mentioned earlier, technique with films and appreciating the hard work that goes into it, but not necessarily in the sense, as Spencer put it earlier, of you shouldn't necessarily appreciate art just because of the amount of time that went into it. And it's not that. It's the skill and the craft and being an actual artist. So I love animated films. And I would have to recommend, there's another kind of touring film fest called the Animation Show of Shows, which the UICA used to host that pretty regularly. RIP to the UICA Cinema. Maybe we'll see if we can make it happen at Wealthy Theater, I don't know. But I'm sure you can stream it online. And I've come across some really fantastic animated films from around the world in there. And they're short, so it's easy. You could sit down and watch a whole program of 2 hours or just go down a rabbit hole. They have a bunch of links to great animated films, and some of them go on to be nominated for a variety of awards, one of which, of course, everybody knows, the Oscars. And I got to say, my other favorite thing in the vein of shorts is watching the Oscar-nominated shorts, which I feel like is overlooked, and it's so disappointing that we don't highlight the shorts that get nominated, because some of them are just unbelievably moving. A lot of them are independent films that are made, and that's the heart of filmmaking. That's what we were talking about earlier, of the Hollywood churned out films versus the indie filmmakers, and that's kind of the heart of experimental filmmaking. So they do have documentary and live action and animation, and those usually are available for streaming online too. So if you watch this program and you're more drawn to the stories that have more narrative, as we talked about, but you like the short format, go check out those, either the Oscar-nominated shorts or the Animation Show of Shows, and it'll give you a good taste of films from around the world, not just cartoons streaming on Netflix, All right. Well, any last thoughts before we close out this discussion?
Not really. I would say that this was a blast. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, again to the library, because having this available to folks is so great. Yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah,
well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you both, and again, I'm so grateful for an opportunity like this to be able to pick your brains and hear your perspectives and the way that you interpret the films differently. And we all have different perspectives, sometimes similar. But I think it was a really wonderful conversation, and I hope that we can do this again next year. So until then, thank you guys all for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
Bye.